Well, hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today you are in for a treat. I've got the one and only Scott McKenna here on the channel. So Scott, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Nice to finally connect with you virtually here.
That's so good. Like I was thinking about this. If you guys don't know Scott, you got to check out his YouTube channel. I found you back in the day whenever I was actually having to film wedding videos as a side hustle. Mm-hmm. And you know, you got a wedding video now that has like over 1 million views, right, on your channel?
Yeah, yep. Wedding was funny. That's how so many people come across me. As I feel like weddings are literally like the number one side hustle that video people start with because it's the only thing you can do on weekends.
Absolutely.
So it makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and I didn't even realize at the time until I started following your story that you were actually on staff at a church. You were a worship pastor, but you had a lot of similarities to me as far as like having to do some of this video stuff. But your story is really interesting, and I think our guys that watch this channel will resonate with it. And I want you to just tell us about this experience that you've had, because you have now transitioned from working full-time at a church to being really a business entrepreneur. Like you own multiple businesses and you're doing all kinds of things. So my first question is like, what made you make that decision to kind of start making that move in your life?
Yeah, I mean, I was a full-time worship leader / video person. I don't remember exactly what the actual title was or whatever. It was like worship and tech media, something, you know, churches, they have a lot of crazy titles. But yeah, I was doing worship full time, and then I was doing all the video stuff as well for the church. And before I did that, obviously I was a musician full time for almost 10 years before I kind of decided to go into ministry full time. I kind of grew up playing in worship teams. I grew up kind of doing all of that. So I grew up in the church, learned how to play guitar in the church, learned how to basically do most things I know in the church growing up all the way until I basically went full-time on staff. And I was on staff for about 4 years. And during that time, that was 2014 to mid-17 was basically when I was on staff. And when I was on staff, and in 2015 is when we had our first kid. And so quickly, I was during that time building kind of my side hustle, and I always kind of felt like that's what I was going to do long term, was something in the video world or just something more for myself from a business perspective. I loved worship stuff. I still do. I'm still actively involved with the church, still do lots of stuff, love worship leading. So I never was trying to replace the church job just simply because I didn't enjoy doing it. It really didn't have to do with that. It had to do with the fact that as we had our first kid, and as I started to realize that, you know, the reality was at the time my wife was not working, and I was obviously supplying entirely for the family. And ministry, I'm sure we'll talk about this, it can be tough sometimes because obviously money doesn't always come with the skill sets you have to make it worth being able to do it full time. So you can love it to death, and you can also be a little bit tighter for money than you'd prefer. And so I kind of was naturally building my video business on the side and kind of thinking that eventually at one point it would probably get to the point where I would be able to, if I wanted to, replace, you know, my job. And so that was kind of what factored in, is that I wanted to basically have more freedom with my time. And it was really tricky to obviously have a kid and work full-time 9 to 5 and then come home when I would edit weddings and do that night after night. I was working probably 60, 70 hours a week all the time, editing till I went to sleep, woke back up, do the same thing over and over, while also that whole time building my YouTube channel. So I would basically just work all the time. Every hour that I was basically up and not eating, I was basically always working, which I knew was a season. It was not something that I was like, oh, I'm just going to hustle forever. It was like, I knew that was just part of it. But I quickly realized it wasn't sustainable, and I wanted to be able to have some more freedom with my time and my weekends and my family. And so I kind of decided to move in that direction in 2017.
2017. Okay. Wow. So you've been at this for quite a while now. Whenever I think about that, man, that just resonates, I think, with hopefully a lot of guys. I know it does for me. I feel this tension as a worship pastor that, you know, I've been doing this for years now. I'm almost 40 years old. And you start to get into that season of like, man, I want to provide for my family. I want my kids to be able to go to college. You know, I want to invest well, but I also don't want to be a burden to my church. I feel that like, you know, Paul kind of talks about that a lot in the scripture where he's like, you know, I don't want to put any more burden on you. I'm going to build tents and do this stuff. But then he also talks about, you know, the other side of that, the flip side, and being provided for. But that's why, for me, I'm starting this YouTube channel. I've been on this. You guys have followed the journey, and that's supplementing my family's income, and that's a great thing. And so it's cool to hear you talk about that and how you've kind of made the switch. But when you think back to 2017 and you made that transition, what were some of the mistakes that you made or things you learned along the way as you transitioned kind of out of the full-time ministry job?
I mean, I like to think, I'm always learning no matter what. So I look at every mistake as an opportunity and as something that I could learn from. And I like to think that I was actually I was doing the right thing, which was not just saying, you know what, I want to do video full time and I'm going to do it. I'm just going to hope it all works out. I was strategic about the fact that I didn't decide. I was not one of those people that was just going to say, I know I can eventually make the same amount of money, and so I'll just go on it and, you know, live on prayers. And, you know, I wanted to basically make sure that I was actually being good to my family and saying I'm not going to give up a salary job with health insurance until I knew that my side hustle, or in this case, you know, the video business, was not only potentially making the amount of money that I was going to make, but it was making the amount of money that I was making with a part-time, you know, effort. So I looked at it and said, okay, at least, you know, the one good thing about weddings was the fact that you kind of knew in advance what your year was going to kind of look like. So unlike a normal video production where you're kind of, you know, you might be going month by month with different clients and all that, weddings were a little bit easier to predict because you could say, I know I'm making X amount of dollars in this year. I already have deposits and I have, you know, whatever. You can kind of just easily look at it and say, here's how much money I know is coming in monthly. So I kind of looked at it and said, when that amount gets to exactly what I was making, I was safe enough to say, okay, well, I know financially I can do this because I know that if it's already making that amount of money with basically a part-time effort, that, you know, the sky's the limit if I actually just put my full effort into that. So I think that it wasn't as much something I learned as much as something I put into practice, which I totally believe that if you are trying to, whether you're working at a church and you're trying to do something else or you just have a side hustle in general, if you are supplying for your family and you are in charge of, obviously, the finances to make sure your family can live, don't let your ego get in the way of you making the right decision rather than just the decision you want to make. And that's the thing I can't tell people enough, because you can't, it's not fair to your family. It's not fair to anyone who's relying on you at all for you to be like, oh, but I just have this dream. I want to own a business one day and be able to have all the freedom. And it's like, well, great. But if you don't have it yet, it's going to be the entire opposite of what you think. It's going to be the most stressful time of your life. You're going to have nothing but arguments with your spouse or your significant other. And you're going to feel just overall like it was a major mistake. So I like to think that I was smart in that side of it. Obviously, you learn a ton when you really go into business, of course, but really I had to think about not just the salary side of things, but if I then have to get my own health insurance and I have to get anything that basically, it's not just simply how much money do I get in a paycheck that I need to replace. It's all the things that factor into that, and making sure that you really are going to be okay if you move on. And I will say, going back to what you said about obviously feeling like the burden, it's a tricky spot. It is a really tricky spot to love what you do in ministry, to really feel like God's called you to do that, but also have the actual reality that you might not make as much money as you really need to survive. And I feel like the one thing I would try to tell people is to not, I think there's this bad, I want to say this the right way. I think there's this bad, misconception that if you don't feel like you're making enough at a church, like that's a hard issue and you're just in it for the money. And I just don't believe that. I feel like God has given me gifts to do some different things, and I still use a ton of my time, and I volunteer and do different things at my church, and I still believe firmly that, we're called, ministry is not just obviously working at a church. You're in ministry at all times as a Christ follower. You're supposed to be ministering to everything in everything you do. So I feel like we can get ourselves in trouble because we are afraid to have those conversations with our pastors or the people that would potentially give us raises, because we're kind of like, oh, they're going to think that I have the wrong intentions and blah, 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 blah. And I would say that if you are so afraid to have that conversation, or you've had that conversation and it's went so poorly, you might be in the wrong church, because a church that truly values who you are, that you can't honestly have that conversation with, might not be necessarily under the best leadership. Because and I know it's hard, because churches obviously have different budgets, and they try as best they can to obviously have as little amount of people do a lot of things. So obviously there was a lot of things that I was doing when I was on staff, but I had good conversations. And the interesting thing about when I did it too is I kind of made the decision and said, because this is not just a money thing for me, it was more a freedom thing. I knew that as soon as I approached them for the first time and said, listen, this is kind of where I really feel like God's calling me to step out of ministry, I went there kind of knowing, I know for certain that a raise opportunity was going to come my way. Like, that's just a given. I knew like that was just going to happen, because obviously it's more money to replace someone than it is to just give them more money. But I went in saying, like, this is not about the money to me. It was more about the freedom I had in life. So I was prepared to have the conversation of how much I appreciated that they did that, because that's what they ended up doing right away. And I was like, I want you to believe me when I'm saying the reason I'm coming here is not just because I want more money, because it wasn't about just simply paying me more. It was that I just kind of wanted more freedom. I was in this situation where we now had a kid. My wife would, she has family on the West Coast, and I have all family on the East Coast. So she would want to go visit them for different Christmases or Thanksgiving or all these different things, or Easter, and like all the times that as a ministry person, you ain't leaving no matter what. So don't even think about it. So she went and visited them by herself. And like it got to a point where I was like, I just can't do that. Like, that's just not, I get one time with my kids at this age to be able to do that. And I refuse to be 100% tied down to every major holiday that we really are. It's the only time we really will travel for. So that's kind of what factored that all in to me. But I would say, like, just don't feel bad about having that thought, because it's hard for certain people, and depending on where you live and depending on kind of what you do, that's something that, I mean, everyone's going to face at one point. And yeah. Don't be so hard on yourself that you feel like you can't, like you have the wrong motives if you're questioning that. Man,
I love that, because sometimes you feel like it would be too like business-like corporation if I was to go and have these conversations. But at the end of the day, you're trying to take care of your family, and I think people, they want to take care of us at our churches too. So just having those conversations, I think, is a healthy thing. How has ministry changed though for you now that you're not paid to do ministry? Some people I've heard, like, it's actually so much better because I don't come into it with all these responsibilities, and I just kind of get to lead when I want. And what do you think, like, as the coming at it now from volunteer, how's that changed?
So I will say it's even different up to today, right? So let's catch you up a bit. So I would say the first part about let's go immediately following that, I was straight up a volunteer. So I was a volunteer and nothing but a volunteer. And obviously that felt amazing, right? It's like I could hit the decline button for the first time in my life on Planning Center. Like I've never experienced that in my life. Now, granted, I still wanted to be the volunteer. I always said when I left the church, I said I'm going to be the best volunteer you've ever had. I'm going to be the volunteer that we always wanted a volunteer to be, which was someone that blocked out their dates, which was someone that always hit accept, which was someone that always showed up, which was someone that never left it yellow. All the things I'm talking about, all the Planning Center stuff, and so I tried my very best to obviously do that right away. But of course, it was great because I could block out a month because I was, going somewhere, doing something else. And so that was all really great. Now, I will say it was actually, I think, a little harder for me than I thought from a standpoint of even to this day, which I'll catch you up on. I love leading worship so much, and I loved being a part of the church, I think, even more than I thought. And I think honestly, I really I really needed it. Like it's one of, I think, the toughest struggles, I think, of me leaving ministry, right? A lot of people want to go into ministry because they're saying to themselves, like, I just want to be around more Christ followers and blah, and it will be helpful. And I think that 100% was actually very helpful for me. It was really good for me to constantly be in meetings about that stuff, because it just makes you obviously think more, which is great. You don't get so tied up in life. I will say it's sometimes the opposite for some people, because some people, as soon as they start to learn the ins and the outs of working at a church, they realize, oh, this isn't as great as I thought it was. I will say I didn't really struggle with that side of it, because I just realized it's also, there are certain things that churches do that are like a business. What they're not trying to necessarily, they're not calling themselves a business, but there are things that still go on that are just like a business in terms of decisions that have to get made. And so I definitely missed actually some of that on a regular basis. I missed having to choose songs, meaning I had to spend time in the Word to figure out what was the good songs and to pray about things and all that. That going to a point where it was like, I'm scheduled, here are the songs, do the songs, cool, thanks, you did great, have a good week. It felt a lot more empty, because it was kind of, I hadn't gone through the whole process that I used to go through to actually pick and choose songs that I felt like worked for the church. But going full circle, what's been interesting is about for 3 years after I built that, or after I left the church and was building my video business and kind of just volunteering, I kind of slowly started backing out more and more from volunteering, because I also realized at that point I wasn't going to serve as much as I was, and now doing it for free, because that would be totally not what I said I wanted to leave for, which is freedom. That would have been like a million times worse. So I kind of backed out a little bit from doing it as much. And then I just started to miss it like crazy, because now I had this huge void in my life for the first time of not just worship leading, but music in general, because I had done music for so long that suddenly that was just gone from my life in a big way. So I started this side project called the Shelter Collective, which was all about basically bringing a bunch of musicians and worship leaders together from all different churches to continue to just do worship stuff together. And it kind of was started during COVID. So we did like our first kind of worship night out of nowhere. My vision has always been that when I was full-time in worship too, I realized there's just this incredible need for supporting churches and worship leaders, because as a worship leader, I was on 50 weeks a year, and I just, I barely had any help at the time, and even volunteers obviously could only give so much. So I felt this nonstop pressure of, every single Sunday comes, right? And it's this hard reality. And so I started this Shelter Collective with the grand goal being that I'll continue to build up this whole collective full of musicians and worship leaders and worship pastors and people that the church as a whole, potentially nationwide, could look at us as a resource to help resource their church with worship leaders, with musicians, with worship pastors, some on an interim basis where it's kind of, hey, our worship leader's sick, we desperately need someone to help, and can you help? Others, if, hey, we're going through this transition where we don't have a worship pastor at all, can you help? Others is, we just need a keyboard player. So I was like, you know what? This is absolutely needed, and I knew it was needed because I was in the position knowing how much I needed that at times, right? And so that was the goal of starting the Shelter Collective. And then as soon as I started that, about, a year and a half later, I came across an opportunity that someone through a connection I had that kind of heard what I was doing a little bit and saw some of the Shelter Collective stuff, was like, hey, there's this church that just let go of their worship pastor, and they're hiring a new worship pastor. Can I just send your name along? Maybe you can lead worship every once in a while and help. And I was like, sure, that's no problem. Well, 18 months later, I've been kind of overseeing their whole worship arts department as they're transitioning. So they have multiple campuses. I lead maybe twice, sometimes 3 times a month, but I have the flexibility to do it when I can. And they have 2 full-time worship people, and I kind of have been coaching and helping them because they're newer. They had a worship pastor that was in charge of the whole department, and they were kind of leading and helping when was needed. And then now I'm kind of somewhat back in ministry, but not really. Like it's actually part-time, but I get to do a lot of the stuff I really enjoyed. Obviously, I do realize that that's probably a season too, because it's pretty busy. But fortunately, with the exact way that it worked out with timing wise, and just with some business things and some letting go of some other company stuff that I had previously done, I don't do the weddings anymore. I have started to let go of certain things so I could take on other things. And the Shelter Collective is something that I, feel really, really strongly about, that it's something that I really feel like I want to build this year and into the ongoing years, because there's just, I think, need for it. I feel like there's just not a lot of help for churches when they need that kind of stuff.
Wow. That's so cool to hear you talk about, like, I never thought about the loss of the creative process being part of something that you really miss, but like that totally makes sense to me, that you move from being the person that's actually creating these, worship experiences, but then now you're just somebody that's executing, and it's a whole different kind of take on it. So yeah, I could see.
And I think some people love just the executing. I can totally get that there's obviously also some beauty in that, because there is no pressure, right? You can just do the songs, and if the songs don't work well, or it's a bad song choice or bad set choice, it's not ultimately on you to do it. But part of that I also don't like, because I felt like one of the things I just felt like I had a good sense that God kind of gave me gifts for was crafting services, was being able to think about how to pick the right songs, the right keys, the right leaders, the right transitions, the things that are to me the overall worship experience. I felt like there are some giftings in those that I really enjoyed, and I felt like also had some skill set for that. I sometimes did miss it, because as just the executor, there were many times that I'm like, I know it's preference, but I don't love that decision that was made, and now I'm the one that has to execute on. And it was even more difficult in my case, because I had been on staff, been the primary person you saw on a regular basis, and then I was the volunteer. But I had to, obviously, I had to make sure ego didn't get in the way of the side of, like, I didn't want people to think that now all these decisions that may seem very different, like, hey, like, these aren't me anymore, these aren't me making the decisions anymore. Then I quickly realized, like, obviously, that was more of an ego thing that I was worrying about. But at the same time, that was difficult, because I had been making the decisions. We had seen the church grow a lot, and then it kind of went to a different setup, and it was kind of a little bit weird to get used to, because you're kind of now having to just. But then it put you in an interesting situation, because you realize, hey, as a volunteer, when you ask volunteers to lead songs, when you ask them to, do this or do that, they haven't necessarily been praying about what that Sunday looked like and what went into the factors. So it's different. It's like different. It's you're telling people, even a congregation, right? You're telling them the words that they have to sing, which is a weird thing to do. Like you're picking songs for a church, saying, here's what you're putting the words in their mouth, and then you're sometimes judging the response when you're not realizing, well, you've been in these songs, you've been in prayer about these songs, you've been in thoughts about these songs, you've been in meetings about these songs, you've done a whole lot of things, and they just got done, screaming at their kid on the way to church. How do you expect them to just suddenly come in and be in the same incredible worship moment that you are? You can't expect that. And so I always would try to do my very best of, even when I was talking to people when I was on staff, of realizing all we can do is prepare ourselves and pray about this enough to do the best possible job we can when we do it, and the rest is up to God. Like let Him do the work, and don't judge. Like, what are we going to judge? A song went well because there were a certain amount of hands raised or a certain amount of applause after the song. Like, that's just such a terrible thing to judge it on, because you just don't know how people are coming in. I mean, the bigger your church is, the harder it is to connect with people, because you have so many people that if you were to judge, if you were to have people raise their hands and just say what's actually on their mind this morning and how they're doing, it'd be all over the map. Yeah. Right? There's people coming in in the greatest season of their life. There's other people that are coming in they just have lost someone super close to them. They're in all, and we've been rehearsing leading up to it and praying together as a team and having this super impactful moment. And that's why, I mean, we're going to go down tons of rabbit holes, but why I feel like as worship leaders and worship pastors, it's so important to connect with your people and your congregation with your eyes open and lead them in worship versus being in your own place of worship. As worship leaders, we are called to lead people in worship. And when I see people that are totally eyes closed and totally in this beautiful place around worship, that's nice. And I'm not like challenging whether it's authentic, but it's like you're not inviting people in. And you're kind of missing the point if people are almost wondering, hey, like it must be nice to be wherever she is because I'm not experiencing that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That kind of stuff just drives me crazy because it's kind of like, guys, we're supposed to be leading them, not like, hey, let us have our moment here. It's like,
absolutely. Yeah, that's great thoughts. I love it. When I hear you talk about that time when you were kind of doing both jobs, trying to build one business up to maybe someday go full time in that, and I hear you talk about how many hours you were working, how do you talk about and how do you wrap your mind around the work-life balance thing? You got your kids now, you're married. How many businesses are you running now at this point, and then doing part-time ministry as well? How do you handle all this?
So here's what I'd say. Work-life balance does not exist. And I think that you get yourself in severe trouble if you think that there's a arbitrary number that means it exists, right? There are seasons. You never are fully there in one way or the other on anything that you're doing. So there's always just these shifts where my wife knows when certain, in ministry, she knew that during Christmas time, during Easter time, months leading up to it, I was going to be spending a lot more time working than I normally do. And she knew that as I was building a business, that what the goal was, that she just knew that there's some, transitions and some seasons in there that are super busy. I also know that some people will say that if you work 40 hours a week, you're working too much. And I also know that some people will say if you're not working 70 hours, you're lazy. So my whole thing has been, I could care less what you think about my work-life balance. I care what the people closest to me think about my work-life balance. Meaning, if my wife and I have had great conversations and understand the season we're in and understand she 100% supports, is okay with, understands it may look like I'm super busy, but knows that I'm dedicated to the time that I give to her, my family, whatever, and she knows that it doesn't really matter what the outside world says, that I'm doing okay in her book. That's all I care about. And so, yes, it was insanely busy, but she also realized, just like I do, yes, I never get the time back that I didn't necessarily spend with a 1-year-old and a 1.5-year-old. But I also know that at 1, 2, and 3 years old, it's a different season than your kids know compared to now, right? The time that they know now when I don't say goodnight to them. They know now when I'm gone for a couple of days traveling or whatever. They know. They ask when I'm coming back. They talk. When she was 1, when she was 2, she doesn't know that stuff. So my wife and I knew, like, that was the hustle season. That was the season where I said, I have to go hard now because it's ultimately the way that I can get the freedom that we're hoping to have down the road. And it was, as long as she understood it and she believed that I was trying my best to do it, that was like what's most important to me. But the idea that you can put this perfect number on anything over this amount of time, my work-life balance is off, because it just might not be. Someone that is single, or someone that's engaged, or someone that has no kids, their definition of good work-life balance is entirely different than mine.
Yeah.
And so the more that you can really just have the conversations with the people who you truly care about is really, I think, the unlock to realizing it. And then also realizing that sometimes it's way off. Sometimes my brain's way too much on work. And sometimes I actually, these days, feel like sometimes I don't work enough because I'm so sidetracked with things. So it's a nonstop balance back and forth. And if you don't beat yourself up on it, I think that's the key. Don't care about what someone else's work-life balance is, because they could have all their opinions that they want. Does it really matter other than the people that you actually care about?
Yeah.
That's my thought.
Well, I think it's something definitely in the churches that we have to guard against, at least thinking and having those conversations. Even in our life, my wife now is full-time at our church as well as our kids minister. So our whole lives revolve around this place. And so it's like, can we have a conversation that doesn't actually mention our jobs or church? It's tough sometimes. And so, but I think it's in the church at large will allow you to get out of balance because, like you said, there's so much need for people to serve. And if you're willing to give us that time, man, we'll take it. So,
and that's a great point. What I was actually going to say that I just thought about, where I think it's so important as people in worship ministry, or really any job, but specifically in churches, you set an expectation for what you're going to do all the time by what you do all the time. And so I look back and I say to myself, I wish I had more support to help with this, or I wish I had this, and I wish I had more people that could help with video, and I wish I could have. But here's what the church saw. All the videos were getting done. All the worship was done well. And why did they need to hire anyone else? They didn't necessarily see all the extra time I was putting in. They didn't see the nights that I was working trying to do it. They didn't necessarily even see the stress. Granted, okay, maybe I did a good job then of doing my job and just keep my mouth shut and being okay. But if you suddenly go crazy hard and have a terrible work-life balance just to accomplish a bunch of stuff over the course of months saying that like this season will end, I bet it won't, because you're setting up the church naturally. As you know, it's like the pastor of a church doesn't know what a worship leader even does 99% of the time, other than the Sunday morning. So you can't expect him to. The same way you don't know what they do. So all they can see is the Sunday morning good and whatever other task you're responsible for. In my case, it was video. Our video is getting done. Cool. They didn't realize for the first 2 years that I was using all my own camera gear. They didn't realize they didn't even have camera gear until I eventually said, you know what? It's not rude of me to kind of say, hey, it's not fair that I should have to bring in all my stuff from my, and as soon as I told them, I was like, well, wait, what do you mean? It seemed like all the videos were getting done. I was like, yeah, we're using my stuff. As soon as I basically just very kindly said, like, we can't use my stuff anymore. It's not fair. What happened? I got money to buy the stuff that I needed. But why would they have expected that they needed it if I was doing it? So you almost have to, and it's the same in the business world, right? It's no different for the boundaries that I set up for clients that I have now. If I respond back to every email and every text message and every single thing every time a day, then they'll just keep messaging me every time a day expecting a response. If they know that they're not going to get in touch with me after a certain time, they'll stop trying. And that's just called being smart with your time. Like, your time is your time. You don't have to feel bad if you are crazy busy at work and on the weekends you're enjoying time with your family and doing nothing. Like, that's your time. Don't feel like just because you're busy, if you have worked the hardest you possibly can in the amount of time that you're paid for, then that's what you were, that's all you can do. Now, if you're, slacking off and working on a bunch of other stuff on your work time, that's a different story. But if you're working your butt off and you can't maintain the work that you have to do, then have a good conversation about that and try to figure out how you can get past that. Because you going super hard and putting in 80 hours a week when you're only getting paid for 40, I love that attitude and I can appreciate that. But all it's going to make you do is make your minimum now be 80 hours, because now what you've accomplished in a short amount of time, in their opinion, is mind-blowing, not realizing that you didn't sleep. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, man.
So it's just tricky, and the more that you can kind of set it up and really just have that in your head, I think it helps you, because then you don't feel like you're kind of having to, run 100 miles an hour at all times.
Yeah, yes, I resonate with that so much. I used to really pride myself on being that guy who, if you call me, I'm going to answer. If you text me, I'm going to text you right back. And I prided myself on that. And then I realized, just like you're saying, I'm setting their expectations up that I'm available 24/7. Just hit me up. Yep. And now I've moved to having some actual like do not disturb times that are already like in my screen time settings. You know, whenever this time to this time, it doesn't even notify me that unless it's like these key people that I've set up on my phone. I'm not even going to see it. And that's so freeing because I'm just wired the other way, and I do have to guard against it. So
I had the pastor that I worked for full time. I still have a great relationship with him. He used to say to me all the time in a good way, like, you're not that important, meaning you don't have to answer your phone. Not because we had these conversations all the time, and he was saying like it might sound bad, but he was saying it like in a really good way because people always, it's like when people set their phone down, right? They're always like, what if an emergency happens? Guys, if an emergency happens, people will get in touch with you. It's not that big of a deal. And he always used to say to me, like, you're not that important. If there's something that's so unbelievably crucial that we need you to do last second, chances are that's our fault more than it is your fault. You know what I mean? Like, to a point. And if my primary boss called me on a weekend or something, I would answer it because I knew that he respected enough to say that's his time, and I'm not going to pick up the phone unless I really need something, and not just like, oh, can you run to the office and get this or whatever. And I try my very best to do the same thing with my employees to this day, is trying my best to respect their time and to respect that if I don't need something, to try to schedule the message in Slack or whatever for the next morning. Just to, even though it may just come right to my head and I'm like, oh, I got to remember to tell that, and I'm not doing it to get their attention, they naturally can feel like if they see a notification, they need to respond. And I want them to know, and that's why I try to now, at least with Slack, I'll schedule the message if it doesn't need to be said right then, because then they're just getting it when they're working and not feeling like they have to be attentive at all times. But your time is your time, and it's the number one most valuable asset that all of us have, and yet all of us basically don't even realize it. And we spend so much time wasting the only thing we can't get more of.
Dude.
So,
yeah, that's so true. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. And I just want to say, guys, if you are somebody who is thinking about like, man, how do I side hustle and how do I provide for my family, and thinking through some businessy type stuff on top of ministry, check out Scott's channel. He's got a lot of that kind of leadership-y vibe stuff. I've noticed you've been doing a little bit more of that style content. Is that something that you're leaning into, or?
Yeah, I mean, my life is really entrepreneurship and business more than anything, and especially with like the new podcast that I started, it's actually all around the idea of being more efficient and productive with your time, so that you truly can have more freedom to do the things that you genuinely want to do. Because I kind of absolutely was in a big hustle mindset for many, many years, and I feel like I've kind of, to a point, moved on from it. I'm not saying that I do nothing now, but maybe I've just gotten to a better point in life, but I don't go as crazy as I used to. I mean, like I've gotten my businesses to at least a good enough point that they make money for me and all that, and I feel like I'm at a good point. But I realized very quickly, like, if you would have told me years ago that I would make the amount of money that I had 2 years ago, would I have slowed down? I'd be like, absolutely, like, of course. Well, like, that's all I want, is just to get to that amount of money, and it's just not how it works. Your bar will continue to raise nonstop. And so trying to understand what's actually important and what you really want to do with your life and your time is the most crucial part. And so that's what we're trying to talk about in that podcast, and in my channel in general, is just other things. Obviously my channel is random because I do a lot of other things, but I'm trying to just almost be the anti-hustle person that kind of says, I love working hard for things, and I know that that's the ultimate unlock, but I also know there's a lot of miserably successful people. Yeah. And I refuse to be a miserable person that loses my marriage and family just so that it looks like I'm successful on YouTube because I manage 96 businesses. Like, that's That's just not. Is that really what we're trying to do? Is look good? So it's just important to not emulate people that you don't want to follow.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of entrepreneurs are super motivating to me, and I'm like, gosh, they like, that's inspiring stuff. But then, there's divorces happening, and there's families that are being broken apart, and you're not seeing necessarily that. But anyone you see working 80, 90, 100 hours a week is neglecting some things in life. And just be careful who you follow, because it's not necessarily the life you want to live.
Yeah. Well, you could replace successful YouTuber or entrepreneur with a successful worship pastor, media director, all those things, because it's the same story in churches all across the globe. One of our core values here on our staff is that family is our first ministry and ministry is our second family. And it's a lot easier to put up on the wall than it is to live out. But guys, that's so true. We gotta keep that in check. So I will link in the description like how to get in touch with Scott's channels and Scaling Creative and all these different things, and I'll put those where his socials are so you can follow along. You guys drop a comment on this video and hit a like button and just say thanks to Scott for sharing. And remember, we can always do a lot of great things in ministry. Let's do it all for God's glory.
Yep, absolutely.
We'll see you in the next one.
Thanks.